Let's take a look at the grammar of John 1:1, and especially the last clause, "and the Word was God." As for most of the issues of life, now it is beneficial and it is good to look at these kinds of things. Now, most of us shy away from grammar, and English grammar is hard enough, but understanding these things and trying to follow along with this kind of information is actually very beneficial. And so I encourage everybody, whether you're a preacher in the church or whether you're a grandma in the church, these things will benefit you. But so now, I have another video, make sure you watch that I cover the entire prologue of John. After all, it's the larger context that has a bearing on any one verse. So in John 1:1 we have three clauses, which we'll label A, B, and C as is standard. In A, it says, "In the beginning was the Word." NRK ein halagos. B, "and the Word was with God." Kai halagos ein proston theon. And finally C, "and the Word was God." Kai theos ein halagos. Okay, so while we're in particular looking at the last clause, we of course want to see what's going on in the first two. So, in the beginning was the Word. Of course, Word comes from logos. Now, most of us have heard of that word in sermons. That word is talked about quite a bit. Most are familiar with Jesus being called the Logos. Now, this word was, which comes from ein, I want to look at. Ein is the imperfect tense in the original language. And what that means is that it is an act that is already in progress. So, in the beginning, the Logos was already in progress. And that's what the imperfect does. It looks to the past, at a point in past where an act is in progress already. And so what does that mean? Well, especially when you look at the context, it means the Word was eternal. The Logos is something eternal. Because in the beginning, the Logos already had its being. It is not seen anywhere in the text as coming into being, but it's already in progress. So that's important. NRK ein was the Logos. Okay, B, "and the Word was with God." Now, clearly what John is doing in this clause is he is distinguishing the Logos from God. Now you go on through the prologue, again, check out the other video, and you see that the distinction is Jesus from the Father. So the Logos, being eternal, is and was with God. It says, ein, that's that imperfect word again, with God. He was with God eternally. And if you look at the bookend, which is verse 18, the end of the prologue, and the bookend is re-saying what is being said here in the first. That there is a distinction clearly between the Father and Jesus Christ, and they were eternally with each other. So the distinction, "and the Word was with God," that's showing that there is a relationship. And again, look at the bookend, verse 18, which is re-saying what is being said here. He was in the bosom of the Father. And because he was eternally with God, he, better than anybody, can reveal God. He can explain God because of that intimate relationship in the bosom of the Father. So clearly there is a distinction here. Now, this word here, theon, is God. You notice this word here, ton, theon, it is the article. What is an article? Well, in English, it is the word the. So if you hear me refer to something as the article, I'm talking about the word the. And that'll be significant here. In the Greek, it says, "and the Word was with the God." Now that sounds odd to us in English, but not to someone reading the original language, because the article is used very commonly with proper names and with God. It'll say the John, the Peter, the James, very commonly. But because we don't use the article that way in English, well, we leave it out. So that's why it is left out. So in English, we just say, "and the Word was with God," instead of the God. And now we come to 1:1c. "And the Word was God." Kai theos ein ha logos. So the word theos here is God. Now it looks different, it sounds different from God in B And that's just because in B, God is the object of the verb, and in C, it is not. Both mean God, of course. You'll notice, of course, that theos is, and the Greek here, is in a different word order than that in English. So if we keep the word order in Greek, it would say, and God was the Word. Now why is it different? It's just because in English, word order determines the meaning of your sentence. You know, in English, the subject has to come before the verb. The subject is the noun that does the action of the verb. But in Greek, of course, it's not that way. It doesn't have to come before the verb. Here, it is being used partly for emphasis. So you throw your words to the beginning of the clause in Greek and you're going to be emphatic, you see. And so John is really saying, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So emphasis is partly what's going on here. But the logos, the Word, is really still the subject of the sentence. Now, how do we know that? I mean, if word order, unlike English, does not tell us which is the subject, then how do we know that logos is the subject? Well, Greek has its way of telling us. The fact that logos has the article, and theos does not. We know that logos is therefore the subject, because it has the definite article. Now this is significant also. Now if you notice, once again, in the B clause, as we already stated, that theon, God, does have the article, the God. It does not in the C clause. What does that mean? Why is theos not articular? In other words, why doesn't it have the article? It does have the article, of course, in B. And there's a reason for that. John is saying exactly what he wants to say. But let's talk about what it would mean if it didn't have the article. So if theos had the article, and it said, and the Word was with the God, and the Word was the God, what would that mean? That would really be saying that the Word is the God that He is with in the B clause. And therefore, the two become interchangeable. That's what really John is wanting to avoid here, because he's wanting to show a distinction. Obviously, he's wanting to show a distinction in the B clause because the logos is with God. But in C, he's not wanting to say He is the God that He is with. He's wanting to do something different here. Now, to be sure, in the Gospel of John, you do have Jesus being referred to as God, even with the article. Thomas says, of course, my Lord and my God, and in the Greek it says, the Lord of me and the God of me. But it's a different context. Here, in this particular context, John wants to show a distinction of the Logos and the Father, as we already talked about. So, and in C, having already shown a distinction, he wants to say something else about the Logos. So, my point is, when it says, and the Word was God, because God here does not have the article, John is not identifying who the Word is. He's identifying what the Word is. He is deity. Without the article, in this case, theos is being used as an adjective. We call that qualitative. And we're not unused to this, of course. The standard example here for us in the Bible is, when we're talking about this, if you're reading about this in the grammar, this is your standard example. Of course, God is love. Love here is a noun, but it's really being used as an adjective. We call this qualitative. It's not saying God is somebody named love, and it's the same thing in the text that we're looking at. John distinguishes the Logos from the Father, and yet at the same time, the very next thing he says is, yet, even though the Logos being distinct from the Father, he still is the same nature as the Father. And the Word was with God, and the Word Himself, according to His nature, is God. Now the problem, of course, is that in English, God really doesn't work as an adjective. And so we might say something like, and the Logos was deity. And so here are a few examples, if you want to take a look at them, of some translations that bring out this idea. Now, this is not necessarily an approval of any of these translations. These are examples, though, where this idea is being communicated in English. John is showing very clearly that the Logos is the same as the God that he is with. Not the same as in who he is, but in what he is. But now finally, let's talk about the possibility of translating this as a God. The fact that theos does not have the article, of course, gives some room. The Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, in their translation, the New World Translation, of course, renders this as a God. You see, because in Greek, unlike English, you don't actually have an indefinite article. So you don't have, in English you say a book or an apple, but you don't have that in Greek. You only have a definite article. When a noun needs to be indefinite, they will leave off the article, but it's the context. Commonly, nouns, of course, in many cases do not have the article, but that does not necessarily mean that it is being used indefinitely. And in this very verse, it says, in the beginning, arche does not have an article, but you're not going to say in a beginning, and later on, when it says the Word became flesh, it doesn't have the article, you're not going to say and the Word became a flesh. So it's all about context. Now, without getting too technical here, even though we're trying to be a little more technical than we would otherwise be, so this particular arrangement, this particular order of syntax, that you have a predicate that comes before the verb, and it does not have the article, there's three things in and of itself that could mean. And the context, of course, is going to determine that. It could either mean that it is indefinite, so here it would be a God, so to say what the Jehovah's Witnesses say in their Bible, and the word was a God. It could also be definite. Yes, even without the article, in some cases, a noun can still be definite. Again, determined by the context. So it could say, and the word was the God, which would go back to the same thing we were talking about earlier, identifying this, the God as the God whom the Logos was with in the B clause. And the other option, of course, which is the most likely, just with the particular construction of having the predicate before the verb without the article. Now, I know I'm getting a little bit technical here, and I don't want to lose you, so just follow me, because it's really simple. Just when I'm talking about this construction, I'm talking about just this arrangement of the grammar. I mean, you call that a construction. And this particular construction, it's been studied, and first of all, just the construction alone does not have a lot of support for being indefinite. You just don't find that in many cases in the Bible. Where it is found, it's really rare, and in a lot of cases, debatable. And so, just the construction itself, if you don't even look at the context, it does not have much support for being indefinite. In other words, saying a God. Besides that, the context itself just would not allow for that at all. So, the idea of saying that Jesus, or the Word, the Logos, was a God, well, that would imply henotheism. Henotheism is where you got many gods, but you got a main God and you got lesser gods. Now, why does the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society go with that option? Well, the fact of the matter is because that is the path of least resistance for them, because they believe Jesus is a created being. They believe Jesus was and is Michael, the archangel. So being created, that theologically causes a problem for them, and so what they really have to do is say a God. But despite that, the fact is that the indefinite use is not likely here. That's just not usually the case, even with the construction, let alone the context. The context, the Logos, is eternal. Can't be a created being, a created heavenly being, to be called a God. He is eternal. And in the next verses, of course, the Logos is seen to be creating all things without exception. So a God doesn't work. We've already talked about the problem of this being definite. And the construction itself, if you study it through the New Testament, usually, in most cases, is going to be qualitative. And that's what you have here. It's really beautiful. It's a very beautiful statement by John. I mean, he opens up his gospel saying this. So if I can use my own words from the Greek here, John is saying, back in the beginning, the Logos already was. The Logos is eternal. And the Logos had a close relationship with the Father. And the Logos was, by his nature, the same as the Father. And this, of course, is supported when you move on through the context of him creating all things. And in verse 18, once again, which is the bookend. Why is Jesus Christ able to explain and reveal the Father? Because he has been eternally with him. He knows him more than anybody else. Which is why it says, no man has seen God at any time. But you got the Logos, Jesus Christ, who's been there with him eternally and able to reveal him. So I hope this helps.